They tell you humans are soft, the galaxy's accountants, fragile diplomats from a class, three dirtball. But the wider universe doesn't have security clearance for classified DARPA files. They had no idea who they were truly dealing with, not until a 7-foot predator cub looked up and asked the unthinkable. The Elysium Prime Conclave was a masterpiece of extraterrestrial architecture, a sprawling diplomatic hub where 42 starfaring species gathered to bicker, trade, and measure their respective military might. To the galactic community, humanity was a tier, 8 species. We were the newcomers, the pencil pushers, the logistics nerds who secured supply lines using outdated SpaceX heavy freighters and sold Lockheed Martin sensor arrays at a discount. We didn't have claws. We didn't have plasma-spitting dermal layers. We were, by all biological metrics, incredibly fragile. Victor Hayes preferred it that way. At 52, Victor looked exactly like what his ID badge claimed he was, a mid-level logistics attaché for the United Nations Earth delegation. His hair was thinning and threaded with gray. He wore slightly rumpled, earth-toned suits. He spent his mornings in the Sector 4 promenade, sitting on a bench, drinking a terribly bitter brew made from imported Lavazza beans, and tapping away on a datapad. What the Galactic Registry didn't know was that Victor's official title was a meticulously crafted lie. There was no logistics attaché. Before humanity ventured into the stars, we fought each other in the resource wars. Victor wasn't a diplomat. He was a retired operator from JSOC's classified Wraith division, a DARPA-augmented asset whose nervous system had been rewired for absolute, terrifying lethality. Humanity hadn't sent their warriors to the stars because we knew what we were capable of. We sent our accountants to keep the peace, because if we sent our soldiers, there wouldn't be a galaxy left to negotiate with. Victor took a sip of his coffee, his pale blue eyes tracking the movement across the promenade. The universal translation matrix implanted at the base of his skull didn't just translate languages, it localized names and concepts into familiar Terran equivalents to prevent cognitive overload. That was why the 8-foot-tall, fur-covered apex predators from the Alpha Centauri border were registered in his HUD as the Lycans, and why their individuals bore strangely human names. The Lycans were Tier 1, the undisputed heavyweights of the galaxy. They looked like bipedal wolves crossbred with dreadnoughts, walking with a proud, predatory grace. Their delegation was led by General Harrison, a scarred warlord whose very presence made lower-tier species instinctively lower their eyes. But today, Harrison wasn't in the promenade. Victor's eyes narrowed as he spotted a commotion near the hydroponic gardens. A young lichen cub registered in the translator matrix as Hunter had wandered away from his diplomatic security detail. In human years, Hunter was perhaps 8. In lichen biology, that meant he was already 5 feet tall, thick with muscle, and covered in bristling iron-gray fur. But despite his size, the cub's ears were pinned flat against his skull, and his tail was tucked between his legs. He was cornered. 3 heavily scaled, reptilian brutes from a tier, 3 mercenary guild had boxed the cub against a bulkhead. Their leader, a massive slab of muscle and armor plating translated as Jackson, sneered down at the boy. Jackson's species, the Draconis, had a long-standing blood feud with the Lycans. This wasn't a random encounter. It was an opportunity. "Lost, little pup," Jackson hissed, the translator rendering his guttural clicks into a sleazy, menacing drawl. "Where is your great general now? Maybe we'll take a piece of you back to him. A little souvenir to remind him that Tier 1 is just a title." The surrounding crowd of aliens scattered. Nobody intervened. In galactic society, the hierarchy was absolute. You do not step between a Tier 3 predator and its prey, especially not when the prey belongs to a rival warlord. The local security drones hovered uselessly at a distance, paralyzed by conflicting diplomatic immunity protocols. Hunter bared his small fangs, letting out a trembling growl, but he was vastly outmatched. Jackson raised a heavy, kinetic-charged gauntlet, preparing to shatter the cub's leg. It would be a non-lethal blow, but permanently crippling, a calculated insult to General Harrison. Victor sighed. He really hated cold coffee. He set his paper cup down on the bench. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply walked. Decades of DARPA-funded neurological conditioning kicked in. Victor's heart rate dropped to a glacial 40 beats per minute. The ambient noise of the promenade, the hum of the atmospheric scrubbers, the panicked chittering of fleeing diplomats faded into a dull, tactical background hum. He mentally mapped the distance, the structural weaknesses in Jackson's exoskeletal plating, and the precise amount of force required to neutralize the threat without deploying a weapon. "Excuse me," Victor said, his voice mild, cutting through the tension just as Jackson's arm swung back. Jackson paused, turning his heavy, scaled head. He looked down at the graying human in the rumpled suit, a Tier 8 logistics clerk. It was like a mouse interrupting a lion. "What do you want, ape?" Jackson grunted, amused. "Go back to your Lockheed Martin spreadsheets before I step on you." Victor stopped exactly 3 feet from the brute, positioning himself cleanly between Jackson and the trembling lichen cub. "I believe," Victor said softly, "the boy is lost. I'll be taking him back to the Earth delegation office until his father can be located." Jackson laughed. It was a harsh, scraping sound. The 2 mercenaries flanking him chuckled along, hefting their energy rifles. "You? A Terran? I'm going to break the pup's legs, and then I'm going to rip your head off and drink my rations out of your skull." Victor didn't blink. "You're welcome to try, Jackson, but I should warn you, my insurance premiums are astronomically high." Jackson lunged. To the untrained eye, the Draconis mercenary moved with terrifying speed, his kinetic gauntlet aimed directly at Victor's chest. A blow like that could crater a titanium bulkhead. To Victor, operating on JSOC combat stimulus reflexes, Jackson was moving through molasses. Victor didn't block the strike. Human bone would shatter against the kinetic charge. Instead, he pivoted slightly, his footwork mathematically perfect. As the massive fist sailed past his ear, Victor stepped inside Jackson's guard. With a fluid, practiced motion, Victor drove the palm of his hand upward, striking the hypersensitive auditory cluster located just beneath Jackson's scaled jawline. The impact was sharp, a concussive snap that bypassed the mercenary's armor entirely. Jackson's eyes rolled back, his equilibrium instantly shattered. Before the massive alien could fall, Victor grabbed the extended arm, pivoted on his heel, and applied a brutal, agonizing torsion to the elbow joint. There was a sickening crack that echoed across the dead-silent promenade. Jackson screamed, dropping to his knees. The 2 other mercenaries froze in shock. By the time they registered that, their leader had just been dismantled by a Tier 8 diplomat. Victor was already moving. He closed the gap to the second mercenary, sweeping a leg behind the alien's knees while driving a perfectly angled elbow into its throat. The mercenary gagged, collapsing in a heap of suffocating scales. The third mercenary panicked and raised his energy rifle. Victor didn't even look at him. He simply reached down, grabbed the paralyzed Jackson by his broken arm, and violently pulled the 800-pound alien into the line of fire. The mercenary aborted the shot, hesitating for a fraction of a second. That was all Victor needed. He launched a tungsten-tipped pen from his breast pocket, a standard, modified espionage tool, straight into the firing mechanism of the rifle. The weapon sparked, jammed, and violently backfired, sending the third mercenary crashing backward into a hydroponic display. The fight had lasted precisely 4.2 seconds. Victor stood amidst the groaning bodies, brushing a microscopic speck of dust from his suit jacket. He reached down, retrieved his datapad from the floor, and turned back to the lichen cub. Hunter was staring at him. The cub's golden eyes were wide, the pupils dilated to thin slits. In lichen culture, power was everything. They revered strength, speed, and dominance. To the young cub, this unassuming, furless creature had just moved with the terrifying, beautiful precision of an apex predator. "Are you all right, son?" Victor asked gently, offering a hand. Before Hunter could answer, the floor vibrated. The crowd, which had been silent, now collectively gasped and scrambled further away. A heavy rhythmic thud echoed down the corridor. The air grew thick, suffocatingly heavy with pheromones of rage and dominance. General Harrison had arrived. The alpha of the Lycan delegation stepped into the promenade, flanked by 6 heavily armed honor guards. Harrison was a towering behemoth, heavily scarred from 100 planetary conquests. His eyes locked onto the scene. 3 crippled Tyr, 3 mercenaries, his son standing against the wall, and a frail Tyr, 8 humans standing right next to him. Harrison let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated in Victor's chest. The Alpha assumed the human had been involved in an attack on his heir. "Terran," Harrison rumbled, his voice like grinding tectonic plates. "Step away from my cub, or I will paint this station with your insides." The galactic delegates held their breath. This was it. The human was dead. You do not touch an alpha's cub, and you certainly do not stand your ground when an alpha commands you to move. Victor didn't flinch. He didn't step away. He simply stood there, his posture relaxed but perfectly balanced. But then, the twist happened. Hunter, the young, proud predator, didn't run to his father. Instead, the cub stepped forward, grabbed the sleeve of Victor's suit with his clawed hands, and lowered his head, baring his neck to the human in a universal display of absolute submission. The entire promenade seemed to stop breathing. Hunter looked up at Victor, his voice trembling but filled with deep, instinctual reverence. The translator matrix relayed the cub's words perfectly in English. "Can I be yours now?" General Harrison stopped dead in his tracks. His honor guard froze. In Lycan society, the right of wardship was sacred. A cub only asked to be claimed by someone they recognized as a superior alpha, a being of such overwhelming dominance and strength that the cub's own bloodline paled in comparison. For a Tyr, one predator cub to offer his neck to a Tyr, 8 human was a biological impossibility. It shattered every known metric of the galactic hierarchy. Harrison's rage instantly shifted to profound, terrifying confusion. He looked at his son, then slowly turned his gaze to Victor. The Alpha flared his dominance aura, an invisible pressure of predatory intent designed to make lesser species drop to their knees and vomit from sheer terror. It washed over Victor like a tidal wave. Victor felt it. He closed his eyes for a brief second. For decades, he had kept the Wraith locked away. He had suppressed the hyper-lethal conditioning, the cold, calculating monster that DARPA had built to survive the bloodiest wars in human history. Slowly, Victor opened his eyes, and he let the mask slip. He didn't growl, he didn't flex. He simply looked back at General Harrison and allowed the Alpha to feel the weight of a human apex predator. The aura Victor projected wasn't wild or furious like the Lycans. It was cold. It was the vast silent void of deep space. It was the chilling promise of inevitable, calculated death. Harrison physically recoiled. The 8-foot warlord took a half-step backward, the fur on the back of his neck standing on end. His primal instincts, honed by thousands of years of evolution, were screaming at him. "Prey," his brain whispered. "You are prey." "Your boy is safe, General," Victor said, his voice eerily calm, completely devoid of fear. He gently placed a hand on the cub's head, giving it a reassuring pat. "But you need to teach him to stay close to the pack. There are dangerous things in the dark." Harrison stared at the human. He looked at the shattered mercenaries on the floor. He looked at his son, who was practically vibrating with awe at Victor's side. Suddenly, the galactic registry, the tier system, the spreadsheets, and the Lockheed Martin manifests all made terrifying sense to the Lycan warlord. Humanity hadn't been hiding behind desks because they were weak. They were hiding behind desks to protect the galaxy from themselves. The silence in the Sector 4 promenade was deafening. General Harrison, a warlord who had personally cracked the orbital defenses of the Sirius Prime staging grounds, stood paralyzed by a sudden, inexplicable terror. It wasn't the terror of being physically outmatched, it was the profound, unsettling dread of staring at a seemingly harmless creature and realizing it was a dormant volcano. Slowly, the oppressive, freezing aura Victor was projecting began to recede, folded neatly away behind the facade of the mid-level logistics attaché. The human straightened his tie, the rumpled suit once again defining his entirely unremarkable silhouette. "If you would follow me, General," Victor said politely, gesturing toward the United States Earth Delegation sector. "I believe we have much to discuss away from prying eyes." Harrison didn't argue. He signaled his honor guard to stand down with a sharp flick of his wrist. The massive lichen fell into step behind Victor, his golden eyes fixed on the back of the human's neck. Hunter, the young cub, trotted happily beside Victor, his earlier terror completely replaced by an awestruck devotion. The Earth Delegation office was exactly what the galactic community expected: boring. It was a sterile, beige environment filled with holographic filing cabinets, uncomfortable chairs, and a front desk manned by a human named William, who was currently tapping away at a spreadsheet. "Hold all calls," William Victor instructed as he led the lichens past the reception area and into a heavily reinforced, soundproof conference room. Once the blast doors sealed shut, the illusion dropped. Victor approached the standard-issue mahogany conference table and placed his hand flat against the surface. A biometric scanner, hidden beneath the wood grain, flashed green. The walls of the room instantly shimmered, dropping the beige wallpaper hologram to reveal interlocking plates of hyperdense tungsten armor. The ceiling lowered slightly, deploying acoustic dampeners and a localized Faraday cage. Harrison's eyes narrowed. Raytheon-grade signal dampening, the general noted, his translator matrix identifying the signature of the technology. "You humans buy surplus military tech to shield your accounting offices? We build it," Victor corrected smoothly, taking a seat at the head of the table. He motioned for Harrison to sit. "We just tell the Galactic Registry we buy it from the Centauri shipyard so nobody asks why a Tier 8 species needs military-grade encryption." Hunter climbed into the chair next to Victor, folding his massive furred paws on the table and staring at the human with undivided attention. Harrison remained standing, his sheer bulk making the room feel claustrophobic. "Who are you?" Harrison demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumbling register. "No Tier 8 species dismantles a Draconis shock trooper in 4 seconds. No Tier 8 species projects a dominance aura that makes my blood run cold." "What is humanity, Victor Hayes?" Victor sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "We are exactly what we claim to be, General. We are accountants, logisticians, and diplomats. But we weren't always." Victor tapped his datapad, and a holographic projection flared to life in the center of the table. It showed an image of Earth, but not the pristine blue and green jewel the galaxy knew. This Earth was scarred with glowing red craters, choked by black ash, and swarming with autonomous war machines. "Before we found the hyperlanes, humanity went through the resource wars," Victor explained, his voice detached, factual. "We didn't have alien species to fight, so we fought each other, and we were devastatingly good at it. We didn't use plasma rifles or kinetic gauntlets. We used Palantir Technologies' predictive strike algorithms to assassinate leadership structures before they even knew they were at war. We unleashed Boston Dynamics' automated infantry swarms that didn't need to sleep, eat, or breathe. We biologically augmented our special operations groups using DARPA-classified neural wiring, turning men into living weapons who processed combat geometries at the speed of a supercomputer." Harrison stared at the holographic carnage. The lichens fought with honor, with brute strength, and face-to-face combat. What he was looking at was industrial, mechanized slaughter. "We almost sterilized our own planet," Victor continued softly. "When we finally united and looked to the stars, we saw the galactic hierarchy, the tier system. We saw species like yours, General, flexing your military might, enforcing your will through strength. And we realized something terrifying." "What?" Harrison whispered. "If we entered the galactic stage as a tier, one military power, We would treat the galaxy the same way we treated each other, Victor said, looking up, his pale blue eyes meeting the Alpha's. We would conquer it, not out of malice, but out of paranoia. So, the United Nations made a unanimous decision. We sealed away the weapons. We decommissioned the Boston Dynamics swarms. We buried the Palantir war matrices. We classified our augmented soldiers, the Wraith Division, as deceased. We introduced ourselves as fragile accountants to ensure we would never be tempted to wage war again. Harrison was stunned. The entire diplomatic foundation of the Elysium Prime Conclave was a lie. The humans weren't hiding behind the Council's protection. The humans had built a cage for themselves to protect the Council. Suddenly, the room was bathed in a harsh, pulsing red light. The holographic display of Earth vanished, replaced by a jagged, chaotic stream of data. An automated female voice, crisp and eerily calm, echoed from the ceiling. Critical alert. Palantir threat matrix activated. Massive kinetic breaches detected in sectors 1, 2, and 4. Council security forces compromised. Hostile entities identified. Draconis Bloodsworn faction. Objective: decapitation strike on Elysium Prime leadership. Harrison's head snapped up. A coup, he snarled, his fangs baring. The incident in the promenade. Jackson wasn't just bullying my cub. He was a distraction. They were drawing my security detail away from the docking base. Victor's datapad flooded with localized surveillance feeds. The Draconis hadn't just sent mercenaries. They had smuggled in a private army. Heavily armored Draconis shock troops were tearing through the station, slaughtering the peacekeepers and setting up thermal barricades. They were locking the station down. General, Victor said, his tone shifting. The warmth, the diplomatic softness, vanished entirely. They are moving toward the main council chambers, but a splinter group is heading this way. They know you are here. They are coming to wipe out the Lycan bloodline. Harrison roared, a terrifying sound that shook the Faraday cage. He reached for his comms, but the signal was dead. Jammed. I have no weapons, Harrison growled, his golden eyes wide with a mixture of rage and desperation. And I have my cub to protect. We are trapped in a Tier 8 office. Victor stood up. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, folded it neatly, and placed it over the back of his chair. He loosened his tie. Correction, General, Victor said, rolling up the sleeves of his dress shirt to reveal forearms crisscrossed with surgical scars and subdermal carbon fiber plating. You are trapped in a DARPA staging ground. The heavy titanium blast doors of the Earth Delegation Office shuddered violently. Boom. Dust rained from the acoustic ceiling tiles. The Draconis strike team was using a heavy ion breaching charge. Boom. Hunter whimpered, pressing himself against his father's leg. General Harrison stood in the center of the room, his claws extended, muscles coiled. He was prepared to die fighting, to tear as many scales from Draconis flesh as he could before they overwhelmed him. General, take Hunter and move behind the reinforced pillar near the ventilation shaft, Victor ordered. Harrison looked at the human. Victor had stepped to the center of the room, standing directly in front of the failing blast doors. He wasn't holding a weapon. Terran, you cannot face a breaching squad barehanded, Harrison warned, his pride warring with his deep, primal instinct to obey the terrifying predator standing before him. I won't have to, Victor replied. He closed his eyes. In the back of his neck, at the base of his skull, the Neuralink interface, a classified piece of hardware jointly developed by Lockheed Martin and the United States Department of Defense, booted up. System status. Online. Adrenaline inhibitors. Disengaged. Pain receptors. Muted. Combat stimulus matrix. Injected. Victor's eyes snapped open. The pupils were dilated, completely black. The biological constraints of a 52-year-old man evaporated, replaced by the terrifying, hyper-lethal efficiency of a Wraith operative. Crash. The blast doors blew inward in a shower of molten metal and shrapnel. Smoke poured into the room, followed immediately by 5 heavily armored Draconis shock troops, their kinetic rifles raised and scanning for targets. They expected cowering diplomats. They found Victor. The human moved faster than the Draconis optical sensors could track. He didn't run. He slipped through the smoke like a ghost. He closed the gap on the lead trooper in a fraction of a second. Before the alien could pull the trigger, Victor drove a rigid, carbon-reinforced strike directly into the alien's primary optical cluster. The trooper shrieked, firing blindly into the ceiling. Victor grabbed the barrel of the discharging rifle, using the alien's own panic to pivot the weapon toward the second trooper. A burst of superheated plasma tore through the second Draconis' chest plate, dropping him instantly. Victor didn't pause. The combat geometry flowed through his mind, angles, trajectories, structural weak points. He stripped the kinetic rifle from the blinded trooper's grip, flipped it, and drove the heavy stock into the alien's throat, crushing its windpipe. 3 down in less than 2 seconds. The remaining 2 troopers realized what they were dealing with and abandoned their rifles, drawing serrated plasma blades. They lunged at Victor simultaneously, a coordinated, lethal pincer movement. From his cover, General Harrison watched in absolute, paralyzed awe. The Lycan Alpha possessed immense strength, but this was an art form. It was a macabre, mathematical dance of death. Victor dropped to one knee, sliding under the horizontal slash of the first plasma blade. As he slid, he drew the tungsten pen from his pocket and drove it upward, piercing the unarmored joint beneath the alien's armpit. He twisted the pen, severing the brachial artery, then used the alien's falling momentum to vault himself backward, dodging the second trooper's overhead strike. Landing perfectly on his feet, Victor snatched a severed plasma blade from the air before it hit the ground. With a single fluid backhand motion, he severed the final trooper's dominant arm at the elbow, followed immediately by a devastating kick to the sternum that sent the alien flying out the doorway and into the corridor. Silence descended on the room once more, broken only by the hum of failing plasma blades and the heavy, ragged breathing of the dying shock troops. Victor stood in the center of the carnage, his white dress shirt completely spotless. His breathing was even. His heart rate was back to 40 beats per minute. He turned toward General Harrison and Hunter. "The corridor is secure," Victor said, his voice flat, completely devoid of adrenaline or emotion. Hunter peeked out from behind his father, his golden eyes wide as saucers. The cub wasn't afraid. He was mesmerized. He looked at Victor, then looked up at his father, his expression clearly saying, "I told you he was the Alpha." Harrison stepped out from cover, stepping carefully over the shattered bodies of his blood-sworn enemies. He looked at Victor, his mind struggling to comprehend the sheer, devastating gap between what humanity pretended to be and what they actually were. "We need to reach the council chambers," Harrison rumbled. "If the Draconis decapitate the leadership, the galaxy will fall into 1,000 years of civil war." "They won't," Victor said. He walked over to the ruined blast doors and picked up 2 kinetic rifles from the ground, tossing one to the general, because they made a tactical error. "What error?" Harrison asked, catching the heavy weapon with ease. "They woke up the janitor," Victor replied. For the next hour, Elysium Prime became a slaughterhouse. But it wasn't the Draconis doing the slaughtering. Security feeds across the station broadcast the impossible. A Tier 8 human diplomat, armed with scavenged weaponry and a terrifying silent precision, carved a path through the Draconis mercenary army. General Harrison fought at his side, the massive Lycan acting as an immovable shield to Victor's unstoppable spear. They breached the council chambers just as the Draconis warlord, an immense beast clad in heavy dreadnought armor, prepared to execute the High Council. Victor didn't negotiate. He didn't issue a warning. Using the Palantir targeting data fed directly into his Neuralink, Victor calculated the exact structural resonance of the warlord's energy shielding. He fired a single, sustained burst from his kinetic rifle, overwhelming the shield capacitor, then tossed a localized EMP grenade perfectly between the warlord's armored boots. The resulting detonation fried the warlord's armor, freezing the massive alien in place. Before the warlord could manual override the suit, General Harrison hit him like a freight train, tearing the helmet away. Victor stood behind him, the kinetic rifle aimed squarely at the Draconis leader's exposed head. "Stand down," Victor commanded, his voice amplified across the chamber's PA system. "Or I will redefine the concept of extinction for your entire species." The surviving Draconis troops, seeing their warlord broken and held at gunpoint by a human, dropped their weapons. The coup was broken. In the aftermath, the Galactic Council convened in an emergency session. The atmosphere was completely different. No one looked at the United Nations Earth delegation as pencil pushers anymore. The spreadsheets and the logistics were finally understood for what they were: a leash humanity kept on itself. The Council unanimously voted to reclassify humanity. They weren't Tier 1. They created a new classification entirely: Tier 0, the Apex Guard. Victor Hayes went back to sitting on his bench in Sector 4, drinking terribly bitter Lavazza coffee. He was still the mid-level logistics attaché, but things had changed. No one bothered the humans anymore. The mercenary guilds gave Earth freighters a wide berth, and every afternoon a massive, 8-foot-tall Lycan general would stroll through the promenade, flanked by his son. Hunter would always break away from his father, run over to the bench, and sit quietly at Victor's feet. Because in the galaxy's most dangerous jungle, even the fiercest predators knew exactly who their alpha was. The galaxy thought humanity was soft, but underestimating an Earthling is the ultimate fatal error. Victor proved that when pushed, our diplomatic smiles hide DARPA-level lethality, and even apex predators recognize true power. What did you think of the Wraith Division's awakening? If you loved this HFY sci-fi journey, smash that like button, share this story with your fellow Terrans, and subscribe for more epic cosmic drama.